The year was 2187, and humanity had only just begun to reach beyond its own solar system. Their ships were slow, and their weapons were weak compared to what existed in the wider galaxy. But they did not know this yet. They believed they were making progress, and they were proud of what they had built. Then the Empire arrived and everything changed. They had ruled the galaxy for over 12,000 years. They had conquered hundreds of species and controlled millions of star systems. Their warships were massive, and their technology was beyond anything humans had ever imagined. When their fleet appeared in Earth's orbit, the entire planet stopped to watch. News broadcasts showed the enormous vessels hanging in the sky like metal mountains. People gathered in the streets and stared upward with a mixture of wonder and fear. High Commander led the delegation that came to Earth. He was tall and thin with pale blue skin and eyes that seemed to look through everything they saw. He had lived for 300 years and had conquered 17 worlds in the name of the Empire. To him, Earth was nothing special. It was just another primitive planet filled with creatures who had barely learned to leave their own atmosphere. Captain Daniel Hayes was 38 years old and commanded Earth's orbital defense station. He stood at attention as the delegation toured the facility. He watched their faces as they examined human technology, and he saw the amusement in their expressions. They pointed at control panels and whispered to each other. Some of them laughed quietly. Hayes kept his face blank, but inside he felt a cold anger building. The ambassador was named, and he spoke with a translator device attached to his collar. He called human ships primitive metal boxes. He said their weapons were toys from a forgotten age. He looked at the men and women of Earth's space fleet and saw nothing worth respecting. When Lieutenant tried to explain the improvements they had made to their engine systems, waved his hand and told her it was cute that they were trying. Was the chief engineer on the station, and she had spent 15 years developing new technologies. She had a D in quantum mechanics and had written papers that changed how humans understood space travel. But she was like a child showing off a drawing made with crayons. She kept her composure, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The tour continued to the docking bay where Earth's vessel waited. It was called the USS Defiance, and it was humanity's first ship equipped with an experimental fusion pulse drive. The vessel was also fitted with kinetic barrier systems that had never been tested in combat. Captain Hayes had personally selected the crew for this ship. He believed it represented the future of human space exploration. High Commander walked around the Defiance slowly. He ran his long fingers across the hull and checked readings on a device he carried. Then he turned to his officers and spoke in his own language. They all laughed. When he switched back to translated speech, he called the ship an interesting curiosity. He said it reminded him of the boats his children played with in the bathing pools back home. President Cole waited in the capital city for the diplomatic meeting. He was 62 years old and had been elected to lead Earth's unified government 3 years earlier. He was a calm man who believed in peace and cooperation, but he was not naive. He had read the intelligence reports about the Empire. He knew they had destroyed civilizations that refused to submit. The meeting took place in a grand hall filled with representatives from every nation on Earth, stood before them and made his offer. Humanity could submit to governance and become a protected species. They would be safe from the dangers of the galaxy. They would receive guidance and support as they developed. In return, they would follow laws and pay tribute to the Empire. The alternative was simple. Humanity could remain independent in their small corner of space. The Empire would not bother with them, but they would receive no protection and no assistance. If enemies came, Earth would face them alone. If disasters struck, no one would help. The galaxy was dangerous, and they made it clear they believed humans were not ready for it. President Cole asked for time to consider the offer. He met with his advisors through the night. They argued and debated until dawn. Some believed submission was the safest choice. The Empire was too powerful to resist. Others refused to accept becoming servants to an alien power. They had not come this far as a species just to kneel before strangers from the stars. In the end, Cole made the decision himself. He stood before the delegation the next morning and spoke clearly. Humanity chose independence. They would make their own way in the galaxy. They thanked the Empire for the offer, but they would not accept governance from anyone but themselves. Did not seem surprised. He almost seemed pleased, as if he had expected this answer from such a young and foolish species. He warned them that they would regret their pride. He said the galaxy would teach them hard lessons, and they would wish they had chosen differently. Then he and his delegation returned to their ships and departed. Captain Hayes watched the fleet leave from the observation deck of his station. Lieutenant stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The massive alien vessels shrank to points of light and then vanished entirely. Earth was alone again. But something had changed. Hayes looked at and saw the same fire in her eyes that he felt in his chest. They had been laughed at and dismissed. Their life's work had been called toys and curiosities. They had looked at humanity and seen nothing worth fearing. Hayes thought about the Defiant sitting in the docking bay. He thought about the engineers and scientists who had built it. He thought about the soldiers and pilots who were ready to fly it. They were not as advanced as the Empire. They were not as powerful or as old, but they were human, and humans had a way of surprising those who underestimated them. Turned to him and spoke quietly. She said they had work to do. Hayes nodded. The believed humanity would take centuries to matter. They believed Earth would remain primitive and weak while the Empire continued its eternal rule. They were wrong. They just did not know it yet. 50 years passed after the departed, and the galaxy forgot about Earth. The Empire had rebellions to crush and borders to defend. They had enemies who actually posed a threat to their power. One small planet of primitive creatures was not worth remembering. This was exactly what humanity wanted. Admiral Christopher Lane was appointed to lead Earth's defense initiative when he was 45 years old. He was a quiet man with gray eyes and a mind that never stopped working. He had studied military history his entire life, and he understood something important. The greatest victories came from enemies who never saw the attack coming. They had given humanity a gift when they dismissed them. They had given them time. The Lunar Development Facility was built on the far side of Earth's moon where no one could see it. Dr. Lisa Park ran the research team there. She was brilliant and driven, and she had not forgotten the way they had laughed at her colleagues. Every day she woke up and remembered that laughter. Every night she went to sleep thinking about how to silence it forever. Her team had collected enormous amounts of data during the visit. They had scanned the alien ships whenever possible. They had recorded energy signatures and shield frequencies and weapons outputs. They had not tried to hide anything because they believed humans were too primitive to understand what they were seeing. This was their second great mistake. Park and her scientists spent years studying this data. Some of it made no sense at first. The physics behind technology seemed impossible, but humans had faced impossible problems before. They had split the atom. They had cured diseases that killed millions. They had built machines that could think. When something seemed impossible, they simply worked harder until it was not. Commander Price oversaw construction at the secret shipyards. There were facilities hidden in the asteroid belt where thousands of workers lived and labored. There were factories buried deep inside Mars where new alloys were forged. Everything was classified at the highest level. The public on Earth knew nothing about what was happening in the dark spaces of their solar system. Price was a practical man who cared about results. He did not build ships the way they did. Their vessels were massive and intimidating, designed to frighten enemies into submission before a single shot was fired. Price thought this was wasteful. He built smaller ships that were fast and deadly. Each one was different because each one tested new ideas. If something worked, they kept it. If something failed, they learned from it and moved on. The USS Defiance remained the centerpiece of the program. Chief Engineer Graham was assigned to transform it from an experimental curiosity into a true warship. She was young when she started the project, just 29 years old. By the time she finished, she had gray in her hair and scars on her hands from countless hours of work. Graham developed the plasma lance system herself. It was a weapon that focused energy into a beam so concentrated it could cut through almost anything. The shields were designed to absorb and disperse incoming fire. They were not designed to handle a focused cutting weapon that stayed on target. Graham had found a weakness, and she had built something to exploit it. She also created the adaptive armor system. Traditional armor was static. It sat there and took damage until it broke. Graham's armor was different. It could sense where impacts were coming and redistribute energy across its surface. A hit that would normally punch through the hull would instead spread out and dissipate. The ship could take punishment that should have destroyed it. The artificial intelligence was called Sentinel. It was the most advanced computer system ever created by human hands. Sentinel could process battlefield data faster than any organic mind. It could track hundreds of enemy ships simultaneously and calculate firing solutions in milliseconds. It could predict enemy movements based on patterns that humans would never notice. When Sentinel was installed in the Defiance, the ship became something new. It became a predator. Captain Peter was chosen to command the vessel. He was 42 years old and had survived 3 experimental craft failures during his career as a test pilot. His body carried the marks of those crashes. He walked with a slight limp and his left hand did not close all the way. But his mind was sharp and his courage was absolute. When they told him the Defiance might not survive its first real battle, he smiled and said that made it interesting. His crew were all volunteers. 200 men and women who understood they were flying in an untested weapons platform against an enemy that outmatched them in every way that could be measured. They trained constantly. They ran simulations until they could perform their duties in their sleep. They became more than a crew. They became a single organism with the ship as their body. Back on Earth, life continued normally. People went to work and raised families and complained about taxes. They had no idea that their species was preparing for a war that might never come. The government maintained the illusion of a peaceful, isolated planet. News broadcasts talked about sports and politics and celebrity gossip. Nobody mentioned the secret shipyards or the weapons research or the fleet that was slowly taking shape in the darkness. Admiral Lane watched everything from his command center deep beneath the mountains of North America. He received reports every day from Park and Price and Graham. He tracked the progress of every project and the readiness of every ship. He knew that someday they would remember Earth. Someday they would return. And when they did, they would not find the primitive species they expected. They would find humanity. Lane looked at the latest specifications for the Defiance and allowed himself a small smile. They had 12,000 years of conquest behind them. They had technology that seemed like magic. They had fleets that numbered in the thousands. But they had never fought humans before. They had never faced an enemy that learned from every defeat and improved with every challenge. They had never encountered a species that turned weakness into strength and humiliation into fuel. The galaxy was about to learn why that mattered. The rebellion changed everything. A species that had served the Empire for 6,000 years suddenly rose up against their masters. They seized weapons and ships and began fighting for their freedom. The southern territories of the Empire fell into chaos. Trade routes were disrupted. Military resources were stretched thin. High Command needed to move reinforcement fleets quickly, and the fastest route ran directly through human space. Admiral had risen even higher in the years since his visit to Earth. He now commanded the 3rd Imperial Fleet, a force of 47 warships that could crush entire civilizations. He was given orders to travel through the Sol system on his way to the front lines. His superiors did not bother requesting permission from the humans. Why would they? Earth was nothing. The humans were primitives playing with toys. The fleet would pass through their space like a wind passing through grass. Remembered his visit to Earth 50 years earlier. He remembered the small ships and the weak weapons and the nervous creatures who had refused his generous offer. He wondered if any of them were still alive. Probably not. Humans had such short. By now, the ones who had insulted him by rejecting protection were likely dust. The Third Fleet entered the Sol system without announcing themselves. They did not slow down or send diplomatic messages. They simply appeared at the edge of human space and began moving toward their destination. Their sensors detected the usual primitive stations and mining facilities. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever changed with young species. Then they detected something unexpected. A single ship holding position near the gas giant humans called Jupiter. It was small compared to vessels, but its energy signature was strange. The readings did not match anything in their database. Captain Peter stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched the fleet approach. His crew had drilled for this moment thousands of times. They knew their positions and their duties, but drills were not the same as reality. Reality was 47 enemy warships filling with their massive hulls. Lieutenant Amy sat at the communications station. She was young, only 26, but she had one of the voices had ever heard. When the transmission came from Earth Command, she relayed it without a tremor. Their orders were simple. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not retreat. Hold position and demonstrate that humanity could not be ignored. Acknowledged the orders and turned his attention back to the enemy fleet. They were surrounding his ship now, taking positions on all sides. He counted the vessels and calculated the odds. 1 ship against 47. Any sane commander would have been terrified, felt something different. He felt ready. Admiral hailed the human vessel with contempt dripping from every word. His translator conveyed his message clearly. The primitive ship was ordered to move aside immediately. Failure to comply would result in destruction. He gave them 30 seconds to respond. Replied calmly. He informed the admiral that this was sovereign human space. Any foreign military fleet required diplomatic authorization to pass through. The Empire had not requested such authorization. Therefore, the fleet should withdraw and pursue an alternate route. Stared at thee in disbelief. A human was giving him orders. A creature whose entire species had not existed when his ancestors were building their first starships was telling him what to do. He had lived for over 300 years and fought in dozens of campaigns. He had never been so insulted. He ordered his weapons officers to target the human vessel. The destroyer was closest, and its captain was eager to prove himself. The ship's plasma cannons charged and fired without hesitation. A bolt of superheated energy screamed across space toward the Defiance. What happened next would be studied by military analysts for centuries. The Defiance moved, but it did not move the way ships moved. It did not rotate slowly and accelerate gradually. It simply shifted, faster than any vessel that size should be able to shift. The plasma bolt passed through empty space where the human ship had been a fraction of a second earlier. Before anyone could process what they had seen, the Defiance crossed 12 kilometers of space and appeared directly alongside The movement took less than 4 seconds. Targeting systems tried to track the human vessel, but they could not keep up. Their computers were designed for battles between slow, massive dreadnoughts. They had no reference for what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Laura sat at the weapons console with her hands steady on the controls. She had practiced this moment in simulations more times than she could count. The plasma lance charged, and she felt its power humming through the ship like a heartbeat. When Captain gave the order, she fired. The beam lasted less than 2 seconds. It struck the amidships and cut through the hull like a blade through paper. The shields flared and collapsed. The armor melted and parted. The ship broke in half and the 2 pieces drifted apart, trailing fire and debris and bodies. Silence fell across the fleet. 46 warships stared at the wreckage of their comrade. Their crews watched through viewports and sensor displays as the destroyer died. Some of them had served with for decades. Some of them had friends aboard. Now there was nothing left but twisted metal and cooling plasma. Admiral gripped the arms of his command chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was not afraid. He was furious. A primitive ship from a primitive species had just destroyed one of his vessels in front of his entire fleet. This could not stand. This would not stand. He opened a channel to all ships. His voice was cold and hard as stone. He ordered every vessel to attack. He ordered them to destroy the human ship and leave nothing but atoms. He promised rewards for the crew that landed the killing blow and punishment for anyone who showed hesitation. 46 warships turned their weapons toward the Defiance. Captain looked at his crew and saw no fear. He saw determination. He saw people who had trained their entire lives for this moment. He gave a single nod. The battle began. 46 warships opened fire simultaneously. The space around the Defiance filled with plasma bolts and energy beams and missiles. Any normal ship would have been vaporized instantly. The combined firepower of the Third Imperial Fleet could have cracked a small moon. Nothing should have survived that opening volley. The Defiance survived. Sentinel processed the incoming fire in milliseconds. The AI calculated trajectories and impact points and escape vectors faster than any organic mind could comprehend. It fed this information directly to the helm, and the ship responded. The Defiance twisted and rolled, and accelerated through gaps in the barrage that seemed impossibly small. Plasma bolts passed within meters of the hull. Missiles detonated so close that the crew felt the shockwaves through the deck plates, but nothing hit. Commander Stephen Blake coordinated the tactical response from his station. He was a thin man with sharp eyes who had spent 20 years studying warfare. He understood that this battle could not be won through brute force. They had overwhelming firepower and numbers. The only way to survive was to make those advantages worthless. Blake ordered the Defiance into the heart of the enemy formation. This seemed like madness. Moving closer to 46 warships should have meant certain death, but Blake had studied tactics for years. He knew their doctrine required ships to maintain safe distances from each other to avoid friendly fire. If the Defiance stayed among them, they would hesitate to shoot. The strategy worked. Captains screamed at each other over communications. They could not fire without risking hits on their own vessels. The human ship weaved between dreadnoughts and cruisers like a small fish swimming through a school of predators. Every time they thought they had a clear shot, the Defiance moved again. Captain commanded from the center of the bridge with calm authority. He watched the battle unfold on the main display and made decisions in heartbeats. When Sentinel identified a gap in the enemy formation, ordered them through it. When a cruiser tried to ram them, had the helm spin the ship aside with centimeters to spare. He fought the battle like a chess master who could see 20 moves ahead. Lieutenant Laura fired the plasma lance with surgical precision. She did not aim to destroy ships entirely. That would have been wasteful. Instead, she targeted specific systems: shield generators, engine housings, weapons arrays. Each shot disabled rather than killed. Each enemy vessel that lost power became an obstacle for the others. The battlefield grew more chaotic with every passing minute. The first hour of combat saw 12 ships disabled. Their crews were alive, but their vessels were dead in space. They drifted helplessly while the battle raged around them. Admiral watched his fleet shrink and his fury grew hotter. He had commanded victorious campaigns across half the galaxy. He would not be defeated by a single primitive ship. He ordered his remaining vessels to spread out and create a firing perimeter. If they could not catch the human ship in close quarters, they would surround it and pour fire inward from all directions. The tactic would work eventually. No ship could dodge forever. Chief Engineer Graham fought her own battle below decks. The Defiance had taken damage despite its incredible maneuvers. A lucky shot had breached the hull on Deck 7. Atmosphere was venting into space. Graham led her team to the breach and sealed it in 40 seconds using emergency patches and sheer determination. Her hands were burned from touching superheated metal, but she did not stop. The shield matrix overloaded during the second hour. Too much energy had been absorbed too quickly. The systems that had designed began to fail. She rerouted power through backup channels that were not supposed to exist. She had built redundancies into redundancies because she knew this day would come. The shields flickered back online at 60% capacity. It would have to be enough. Lieutenant Amy monitored communications throughout the battle. She heard the fear creeping into their voices. Officers who had laughed at humanity 50 years ago were now screaming for reinforcements. They spoke of demons and ghosts and impossible machines. They could not understand how one ship was doing this. Their entire worldview was collapsing around them. The third hour of battle was the bloodiest. Admiral finally coordinated his remaining ships into an effective formation. The Defiance could not dodge everything anymore. Hits began landing on the hull. The adaptive armor saved them from immediate destruction, but systems were failing across the ship. Crew members were injured. Some were killed. Made a decision. They had proven humanity could fight. They had disabled or destroyed over 20 enemy vessels. But the Defiance could not last much longer. He could order a retreat and preserve his ship and crew for future battles. He looked at the faces around him. Blake at tactical, at weapons, at communications. Graham's voice in his ear reporting from engineering. These people had followed him into certain death without hesitation. They had fought an impossible battle and somehow survived. Smiled, they had not come this far to run. He ordered one final attack. The Defiance turned toward Admiral's flagship, the massive dreadnought's Pride. It was the largest ship in the fleet and the most heavily defended. Every surviving enemy vessel moved to protect it. Fired the plasma lance at maximum power. The beam struck the dreadnought's shield generator and burned through. The ship's defenses collapsed. A second shot hit the engine array. A third struck the weapons systems. His Pride went dark. Admiral sat in his command chair surrounded by flickering screens and dying systems. His flagship was crippled. His fleet was broken. 22 of his ships were destroyed. 19 more were disabled. 6 had fled into hyperspace during the final hour, their crews too terrified to continue fighting. One human ship remained, and battered and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds, but it remained. The battle was over. Looked at the wreckage floating around them. Metal and bodies and the shattered pride of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. He took no pleasure in the death, but he felt something deeper. He felt vindicated. Humanity had been overlooked. They had been dismissed. They had been called primitive and weak. Never again. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Communication networks carried the story from system to system. Within days, every major civilization knew what had happened near the gas giant called Jupiter. A single vessel from a primitive species had destroyed an entire fleet. The empire that had ruled unchallenged for 12,000 years had been humiliated by creatures they had dismissed as worthless. The reaction was immediate and varied. Some species celebrated quietly in their homes, afraid to show joy openly but unable to contain it completely. Others watched with calculating eyes, wondering what this meant for the balance of power. A few loyal subjects of the empire refused to believe the reports. They called them propaganda and lies and fabrications. But the evidence was undeniable. Sensor logs and communication records and the testimony of survivors all confirmed the impossible truth. High Chancellor called an emergency session of the Imperial Council. He was old even by standards, nearly 500 years old, and he had guided the Empire through countless crises. But he had never faced anything like this. His advisors brought him intelligence reports and weapons analysis and strategic assessments. None of it made sense. The humans should not have been able to do what they did. Their technology was supposed to be centuries behind the Empire. Admiral survived the battle aboard his crippled flagship. He was eventually rescued and brought before the council to explain his failure. He stood in the great chamber where emperors had been crowned and traitors had been executed. He told them what he had witnessed. He described the speed of the human ship and the power of its weapons. He spoke of how it moved like nothing he had ever seen. His voice carried no shame because he felt none. He had faced something new and terrible, and he wanted the council to understand. Chancellor listened carefully. When finished speaking, the old leader was silent for a long time. Then he asked a question that changed everything. He asked if the humans had more ships like the one that had fought them. Admitted he did not know. The answer could be one or it could be hundreds. There was no way to tell. On Earth, the aftermath of the battle unfolded differently. President Daniel Cooper had waited for news in the secure command bunker beneath the Capitol. He was the grandson of the president who had chosen independence 50 years earlier. When the reports came through confirming victory, he allowed himself exactly 10 seconds of relief before returning to work. The next morning, he addressed the unified government and the people of Earth. He revealed the truth about the defense initiative for the first time. He explained the secret shipyards and the weapons research and the decades of preparation. He introduced Admiral Christopher Lane and showed images of the ships that had been built in darkness. The public reaction was complicated. Some felt pride, others felt fear, many felt both. Admiral Lane promoted Captain Peter to the rank of Rear Admiral. The ceremony was simple and brief because there was too much work to do. Was given command of the newly revealed First Fleet. It consisted of 12 ships, all prototypes, all built on the lessons learned from the Defiance program. It was still a tiny force compared to the Empire's remaining thousands of vessels. But those 12 ships represented something the galaxy had never seen. Dr. Lisa Park stood in her laboratory on the moon and watched the news broadcasts. 50 years of her life had been devoted to this moment. She had reverse-engineered alien technology and pushed the boundaries of physics and sacrificed everything for the project. Now the galaxy knew what she and her team had accomplished. She felt tired and proud and strangely sad. The secret was no longer a secret. The work would continue, but it would never be the same. Chief Engineer Graham received dozens of offers from universities and corporations wanting to hire her. She declined them all. Her place was on the Defiance, keeping the ship that had changed history alive and improving. The vessel was undergoing extensive repairs in the orbital shipyards. Graham oversaw every weld and every system check personally. She had built this ship with her own hands, and she would not trust its restoration to anyone else. The strategic situation evolved rapidly. Chancellor made a decision that shocked the Empire. He sent a diplomatic envoy to Earth, not to demand submission or threaten war, but to request formal negotiations as equals. The Empire had never treated any species as equals before. The gesture was unprecedented, and it signaled a fundamental shift in galactic politics. Ambassador Torres received the delegation in the same hall where their predecessors had laughed at humanity 50 years earlier. She was gracious but firm. Humanity would negotiate in good faith. They had no desire for war or conquest, but they would not be dictated to or looked down upon. Any agreement between Earth and the Empire would be between equals, or there would be no agreement at all. The negotiations were long and difficult. Both sides had grievances and demands and red lines they would not cross. But eventually, a framework emerged. Humanity would be recognized as an independent power with sovereign territory. The Empire would not interfere in human affairs. Trade and diplomatic relations would be established over time. Other species watched these negotiations with growing hope. The rebels fighting in the southern territories took heart from humanity's victory. If one small world could humble the Empire, perhaps freedom was possible for them too. Whispered conversations spread through conquered worlds. The name of the Defiance became a symbol of resistance. Admiral stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the USS Horizon. It was larger than the Defiance but built on the same principles: speed and precision and adaptability. Through the viewports, he could see Earth glowing blue and green against the endless darkness. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The laughter of during that first visit. The decades of secret work. The battle that changed everything. His crew moved around him, performing their duties with quiet efficiency. Some of them were veterans of the fight near Jupiter. Others were new recruits who had joined after the revelation. All of them understood what they represented. They were the first generation of a new era. Received a message from Earth Command. Intelligence reports indicated movement in several sectors. Other species were beginning to resist the Empire. The rebellion was spreading. New alliances were forming in the shadows. The galaxy was waking up and humanity was at the center of it all. He thought about Captain Daniel Hayes, now long retired, who had stood on the observation deck and watched the laugh at human ships. He thought about all the people who had worked in secret for 50 years to make this moment possible. They had been overlooked and dismissed and underestimated. Smiled and gave the order to set course for their next mission. The galaxy was vast and dangerous and full of unknowns, but humanity was no longer hiding. They were no longer primitive creatures playing with toys in their small corner of space. They were a force that would shape the future of the stars. And they were just getting started.